Uh, how is an accounting degree different than a different, like an administrative business degree?
So the way I view it, and different people have different perspectives on this, accounting is a specific function within business with a specific career path. Whereas if you just get a general business degree, in my opinion, a lot of times they're not worth the paper they're printed on because that doesn't give you a specific career path. For some people it can work out, but it can be very difficult to get a good job with just a general business degree. Because what does that mean? Are you going to just go straight to management? Because usually management is going to come from one of the functional disciplines within the business world. So someone with a general business degree, maybe they'll get a job as a manager in a retail store or something like that, but usually in the business world you're coming through one of the disciplines. So you're in engineering at a manufacturing company and you work your way up into management through that, or you work your way up through sales, or you work your way up through the finance side, or through some other discipline within the business. So accounting is just one of the disciplines within the business world.
Mm-hmm. And so I imagine you know quite a few accountants.
Yeah, as I've worked at a larger public accounting firm for a number of years, smaller firms, and I've also worked for a client in private industry as a controller.
Well, what kind of a personality does an accountant have? Do they have a generally different personality than other people?
It really takes all kinds. So there's a wide variety of personalities within the accounting world, and it really depends on what you're doing. So some of the very successful partners and leaders of public accounting firms might be very extroverted and very good at sales, for example, because that's actually very important in public accounting. But in general, most accountants tend to be analytical, very detail orientated. The majority of new accountants are actually women these days, because women tend to be more women that are detail minded in those ways. So I think it's 65% of new accountants are women. So in general, there's detail-minded, analytical, and then what's really important, especially as you progress up the career spectrum, is soft skills. You need to be able to communicate, particularly you need to be able to communicate complex things to people that aren't familiar with what you're talking about. Because you might be trying to communicate what someone's profit and loss statement means to them, but they don't know all the accounting lingo.
Mm-hmm.
So the soft skills become really important as you progress.
And so, let's see. Now, there's, as far as these trusts in South Dakota, isn't there a law that says something like that people don't have to reside in South Dakota to take advantage of South Dakota trust law?
Well, the key thing is you absolutely have to have a South Dakota trustee. So you could be an individual trustee or you could be a corporate trustee. So there's actually been kind of a gold rush, I'll call it, of corporate trustees. So lots of new corporations have been formed or new businesses have been formed in South Dakota to be trust companies. And so the key thing is you have to have a trustee in South Dakota. Again, there's the three things. You have to have property or corpus, you have to have beneficiaries, and you have to have a trustee. Well, as long as you're trustees in South Dakota, then you can take advantage of South Dakota law.
But does the trustee have to belong to a trust company?
They don't. No, you can be an individual trustee.
But there are companies that are rising up, is what you're telling me, that do nothing but be trustees.
There's I forget the exact number. I think it's in the 50 or 60 public trust companies in South Dakota.
And how many clients does each trust company have?
It vary widely, and there's a lot of private trust companies in South Dakota too, which typically would only handle one family's trusts, and they have different capital requirements and things. But yeah, it would vary widely. It's kind of like how big is an accounting firm? Well, it depends on how many offices they have, how many people, how many clients they have. So there's a whole spectrum.
Why are there so many banks in South Dakota?
A lot of it has to do with the regulations. So that for the same reason that there's a lot of trust companies, South Dakota makes it very easy to do business as a trust company. They have great laws for trusts, And in the same way, banks, it's a very favorable regulatory and legal environment. So those are the main things driving the activity, is the legal and regulatory environment.
But having all of that money in South Dakota doesn't mean that the people of South Dakota benefit from it, does it?
Not necessarily, because most of it's it could be invested in securities. There might be a South Dakota investment advisor involved. So that brings jobs, of course, to South Dakota. Of course, the trustee brings jobs to South Dakota, and accountants and attorneys, I think professionals. So most of the benefit of this whole scheme is, of the whole trust environment, I should say, is the professionals that are involved. So it brings good jobs to the state. But the money itself could be invested anywhere.
And is it also true that people, that the rich people have to show up in South Dakota at some time or another?
I think where that gets most involved is where there's the private trust companies. There's rules about having meetings in South Dakota and a certain number of owners of the private trust company. So that's where most of the publicity comes from, is there's private trust companies that need a physical location and they need people to be here. So that's why I think it was the Sioux Falls Airport had some expansions to their facilities to facilitate the private jets coming in.
So there's like the very rich people coming to South Dakota for this.
Sure, there's some people that would travel in, and that'll be primarily for the private trust companies.
Now, what about just an ordinary person? Should they have a trust?
I'm not an attorney, so I don't provide legal advice, but just generally speaking, an ordinary person needs to have a will, of course.
Right.
And then another estate planning document that can be important for some people is a living trust, which if you hold your assets in a living trust, generally avoid probate if it's done properly. So the main reason why people use living trusts, which are revocable, meaning you can change them during your lifetime, is to avoid probate. And so from that standpoint, depending on what you have, even ordinary middle-class Americans in some cases are best off having a living trust.
Mm-hmm.
And for that, you don't need a trust company, you don't need a trustee, you're the trustee typically. But then upon your death, there's a new trustee that's written into it. It's kind of like another will. It's like a financial will, but it's shaped as a trust.
So tell me why someone would want to avoid probate.
Probate can be costly and a real hassle, honestly, because you have to go through the legal system. What a lot of people don't realize is even if you have a will, you still have to go through probate. So just because you have a will, which is very important, doesn't mean you avoid probate. It makes it a lot easier. If you don't have a will, you have to go through probate, and the judge has to decide where your money goes, which follows state law, and there's a process for it. But it's very important to have a will, but for some people, it's very important to have a living trust.
And what exactly is a pour-over will?
Pour-over will pours assets that you own, any assets you have and that you own outside of the trust. Okay, hang on. Okay, is this something you should be fighting over? I'm almost done with this.